Okay, thank you for joining. This is a seminar series that is going to be hosted by Dr. Zoe Handley and Dr. Clare Wright, and it is titled, excuse me, Online and In-Person Language Contact During Study Abroad Using the LangTrack app to Explore the Experiences of International Master's Students Studying in the UK. Dr. Zoe Handley is a senior lecturer in language education at the University of York, where she leads the MA in Artificial Intelligence and Technology Enhanced Learning. Her research focuses on supporting teachers to harness technology to create the conditions and engage learners in the processes known to support language acquisition. Her work has explored a range of different technologies with a focus on technologies that support the development of pronunciation and speaking skills, as well as writing. She is also interested in studying abroad and the impact technology is having on learners' experiences of study abroad with a focus on their language contact. And Dr. Clare Wright is a professor of linguistics and language teaching at University of Leeds. She works on how linguistic, cognitive, and intercultural factors impact on the student experience in globalized higher education. Her current research includes projects on digital literacy and training in Gen AI in academic contexts, using online learning to boost critical thinking of models of interactional strategies to support fluency development in different task contexts. Recent publications include journals such as Active Learning in Higher Education, International Journal of Computer-Aided Language Learning and Teaching, as well as monograph on second language fluency with Cambridge University Press. I want to thank you both for joining us today, and I would like to hand over to Dr. Zoe Handley and Dr. Clare Wright now.
Excellent. Thank you for the invitation. I'll just share the slides and then I'll hand over to Claire, who will introduce the talk. So can all see that. I think we're ready, Claire. Yep.
Okay, so thanks very much. I hope we're coming over nice and clearly for you all. We're very grateful to join your network. I've been doing, both Zoe and I have been doing a range of activities over the last few years, which seem to be very tied into the aims of your network. And particularly, I hadn't come across LENet before, so I'm very honoured to be able to join you today with Zoe. So we've, as you gathered from the very nice introduction from Emma there, we've been working for quite a long time on the experiences of international students, and our work is primarily aimed at trying to see what the reality is for students who are in a second language environment, and particularly how successfully they manage to have conversations. This is something I've been looking at in my own research since before 2013, so nearly 12 years. And what we want to do with our talk today is to show how we've been able to use up-to-date technology, and particularly the LangTrack app. And I'm delighted that Henriette Arndt, who was very crucial in developing that app, is with us today to show you some of the reasons why the methodology of using an app for looking at how people engage in different kinds of conversations gives special insights into people's emerging confidence and skills in managing conversations in a second language setting. But before we go on too much, perhaps we just go back there, Zoe. I wanted to make sure we thank all the people who have been critical to this project, primarily through the University of York, where the technology expertise lies. So Phil Harrison and Stuart Lacey and Victor Chijevsky, who have been instrumental in helping design the app to suit the purposes we needed it for, and to our research assistant, Jing Lei Yu, who is a current doctoral researcher at York. But we really can't go further forward without thanking Henriette Arndt and the team at Lund University, Sweden, who developed the original LangTrack app, made it open source software, and so therefore we were able to work with Henriette, who advised us in some early stages of our planning, and we were able to adapt our own version of their original expertise in this field. So thank you very much to all of those. The plan for our talk today, we'll be talking for about 40 minutes, just to show you what the rationale and the research questions were for our particular study, looking a little bit at the theoretical lens, particularly in terms of second language interaction. with a little bit of a quick review of key literature. And then we'll be mainly today spending a bit of time on the methodology that we use so that you can understand then the results that we have, because they're quite rich, they're quite complex. And so we want you to really understand what it is that we think we've found. And so when we come to our discussion about the implications of what it means to try and understand these complexities of people developing their interactional proficiency, you can see how we got there. For the starting point, I think we all are to some extent working in kind of residence abroad, study abroad, international immersion settings. And it's sort of taken for granted, I think, in most contexts, particularly learners themselves, that you need some kind of residence or study abroad to just have the amount of exposure or practice that you need to raise your proficiency up to higher levels, in particular oral fluency and managing to chat. People can rehearse how to perform a given speech or a presentation, but what about chatting? However, unlike the old days, where certainly in my time of residence abroad, a very, very long time ago, you were thoroughly immersed, and the only contact you had back home was a letter once a week and possibly a phone call once a month. The new era of digital communications mean you can now talk to anyone, anywhere, anytime, but crucially, you can do that in written form as well as spoken form. That ubiquity of social media, digital communication tools means it's easy to find people. We therefore can claim that we can make and maintain friendships anywhere, including in the host country. And we know that these kind of social networks can really make a big difference. However, of course, it's also easier to maintain contact with family and friends back home. And we know that in certain kinds of study abroad setting, such as students coming into the UK in big compatriot groups, or for example, in the English-speaking students going to other language countries, it's very tempting to stick with your co-language speakers. Nevertheless, the prediction is that if you have chances for increasing interaction in the target language, that will help. However, it's possible that as you're away from home, you may well be increasing your interaction in your home language as well. So we can see that we could predict both positive and negative impacts on your capacity to acquire the language, develop greater proficiency in the language. So as you can imagine, we're basing our work very much on the interactionist model that goes back quite a long way, but I think still forms a real key element of most models of acquisition. That the more and the better you can use your language in more authentic situations, the more likely you are to make good progress. So our research questions revolve around this idea of conversations. So for us, this is the kind of interactions that happen in real time for real purposes to build friendships, to serve certain purposes, whether that's for study, whether that's for social, whether that's for service encounters. But what we really wanted to do was look at relationship between level of language use and type of language use and purpose of language use and interlocutors who you speak to, and then the kind of markers, particularly in quite high stakes markers of how you're getting on with your academic studies, your academic GPA, and other measures of linguistic attainment. And here we're going to use a vocabulary measure called Lextail for that. So does the more you interact help you not just in your own personal language journey, but in managing your studies and managing your language development? Because I think probably we're all aware of the idea of the evidence out there that in fact the amount of language attainment that can be seen during study abroad can really vary. We know that some learners quickly make large gains and others progress much more slowly, and we even suggest there may be some kind of developmental threshold where if students go with insufficient language proficiency or insufficient ability to take risks, they really seem to make no gains at all. The assumption is that this is to do with amount of language contact, and since the work of Fried et al. From the 90s and other work through the early thousands, using surveys perhaps or other kinds of language contact measures, we are looking at what kind of language use across different purposes and whether the amount of language use, the frequency of language use, the kinds of language use seems to make an impact. And I'm afraid, like most linguistics research, the evidence seems to be rather mixed. So is it not so much the amount of contact, but the depth and the kind of social meaningfulness of your contact, which is why we're interested in conversations. We know from the work of Ros Mitchell and others that the amount of social networks, the type of social network engagement that people have can make a big difference. But as I've already alluded to, we know that where people are on programs that attract large compatriot groups, you know, for example, coming into the UK, we typically have a lot of Chinese students coming on certain postgraduate courses. I've been looking at this since 2013, where they really say that they struggle to speak to the foreigner. And the foreigner, after a year of living in the UK, was in that case, that was me. To that student, I was the foreigner. So there's a sort of sense of staying in this linguistic and psychological bubble, if you like, that means you are not really engaging as much as you can. We also observe from other research, either sociocultural or even academic structural barriers, where proficiency, even if you have good proficiency, that still seems to be a barrier, either to academic attainment or to managing to make friends. What's that got to do with anything digital? Why are we interested in the digital sphere? Well, as we now know, where we can communicate with our phones and in other ways, we do. We are looking at people even in home study contexts being permanently on, permanently connected, the phrase from Vordera et al. 2018. And so if you are always sort of somehow digitally on, what does that mean for people maybe being digitally connected in different languages? So in that sense, the ease of digital communication tools can be both a real potential enabler, as we suggested before, helping people make new friends, engage easily in different kind of communication contexts, but it also perhaps operates as an immersion breaker. You don't get into that mentality of just feeling immersed in that host language environment. So is the amount you use, is the type and purpose of your interactions important? Is it that the more you do in the L2, the better? Well, of course, taking a translanguaging approach, it is both authentic, natural, and indeed equitable and ethical that people will use all their linguistic repertoire all the time. So I think we're moving away from this idea of the more L2, the better as a kind of zero-sum game. It's just perhaps the answer may be more interaction, the better. So how can we tie that down into a manageable, feasible research study? You can see Zoe and I get very interested in these big questions, and particularly me. Zoe's much better at holding me down to feasible and doable methodological design. But what we wanted to try and do was to see whether these digital tools foster communications, what kind of communications, and how that relates to the observed long time problem of how can people feel like they are more able, more confident, and more likely to engage in conversations in the L2 setting. There's a number of different studies that are looking at this in different contexts, understanding how participants interact with their home contexts. Is that actually going to make them feel safer, perhaps, more confident? And it's actually acts as a positive scaffold to socializing then with their host environment friends? Is it that we need to understand how social networks work in more detail, using more qualitative insights? Again, perhaps to reinforce this idea that if people have real problems where they're L2, perhaps they may not feel so confident about using that, they get support from peers using the L1. It's not that they're disengaging from the host language environment, but it may be a sort of stepping stone towards feeling more confident. However, those are raising issues around sort of types and extent and purposes of interaction. What we're also looking for is what happens online, what happens face-to-face. Joe and Rose have quite an interesting study that to some extent we're basing our design on, where they're looking at the types of networks, the types of topics people talk about, the range of activities, whether it's sort of social and so on, and the quite multiplex interactions between all of these. And we wanted to try and make our ways of collating different information points serve that multiplexity. And as mentioned already, with Henriette Arndt et al.'s work from Lund, using an experience sampling app gave us an additional tool where we could try and observe students' real-time interactions in different languages for different purposes in a way that was really easy for students to use. And that gets away, we think, from some of the methodological problems that can be found in more standard retrospective survey-based approaches. So here are our research questions, where I
yeah. So
we're going back to Zoe now.
yeah. Taking that all into consideration. So the fact that we feel that we need to have this much more qualitative understanding of the nature of international students' interactions during study abroad. Our research is driven by a fundamental question of understanding what is the nature of those interactions, taking into account the online and the offline, the L1 and the L2, and the range of different purposes that students might engage in the target language for. So first of all, we're really aiming to have a deeper qualitative understanding that just goes beyond how much a student's engaging in the target language, but to look at this more qualitatively with a focus on interaction, so conversation, because we see this as a fundamental site for learning. And then what we're aiming to do with this study is to get some preliminary insights, because it is a one-shot cross-sectional study. These will be preliminary insights into the relationship between that engagement in conversation in the L1 and the L2, online and offline, for various purposes, and students' linguistic and academic attainment. So these critical variables, the ultimate outcome, I think, for many being their academic attainment, with the linguistic attainment being a potential mediator, but also for many an important outcome too. As we've said, we're using a novel method, a method that's been developed by Henriette Arndt's team. So we're also asking a methodological a question as well. We're looking at sort of what is the advantage of this alternative method? What is the added value? Does it give us something different? In terms of the actual study that we conducted, then this is really meant to be a priming study, to prime a larger scale study that really helps us to investigate in depth all of those questions that Claire were mentioned, and go a little bit broader to think about students' wider experience during study abroad as well. But for this study, what we did was we invited all international students, so international master's students on our respective campuses in York and in Leeds, to participate. I should note that we didn't perhaps conduct this at the most ideal period in the year due to technical difficulties getting everything online. We conducted this at the end of semester 2, just after students had finished their exams and before they were about to go off, do their dissertations, go traveling, and all those things that we know students do in their summer period as well as their studies. So what this meant is we've perhaps got a smaller sample than we would have got if we'd done this earlier in the year, and that the data it reflects that particular point in the year rather than when they're engaged in their studies during the semester. But I think this does give us interesting insights, because during the semester there's many things we know because it's under our control as their tutors. Anyway, we got 18 students to participate. They were mainly female. They were across a range of different subjects. Their ages ranged from 21 to 40 years old. Inevitably, given the cohorts that we teach and we attract to our campuses, they were mainly from China, but we do have a range of other countries represented and L1s, meaning that we've got some quite interesting qualitative insights from our data as well. So I do need to let you know the methodology. So in terms of the methodology, as I said, it was a one-shot cross-sectional study. So we looked at learners' language context, so their interactions during a week that was at the end of semester 2. What we did was we invited them on campus to a computer room where we administered the Lextail test, so a vocabulary task. where basically you present them some words and some non-words and ask them to identify which ones are actually real English words. So that was to give us a measure of their linguistic attainment. We also administered a short questionnaire where, as well as eliciting background information, so that demographic information I've already given you, we asked them to provide their module grades for their first semester assessments. And then what we did was we administered a questionnaire eliciting kind of retrospectively their language contact. So saying, well, in a week, how much do you typically do this and that? So following very much the Zhu and Rose kind of survey. And then what we did was we demonstrated the LangTrack app to them. So this experience sampling where you've got an app that pushes short surveys to the participants a couple of times a day. So we did this. We asked them to participate in these surveys for 1 week, and we administered 4 surveys per day. We also supplemented this with focus groups. This was mainly, though, to help us understand the method, because we're trying to lead this into a larger grant. We didn't get qualitative insights in that sense into their language contact. In terms of the variables that we were interested in who they're talking to, what language, where is the person that they're talking to, is this online or in person, is it written, spoken, and what is it that they're talking about. So while we didn't get that interview data, our aim was to, with this survey instrument, get some really qualitative insights. Just briefly, this was what the interface to the app looked like. As Claire's already mentioned, this is an open source app that anyone could use and tailor to the design of their study. We, though, are kind of continuing the kind of research that Henrietta herself was doing. And so, as I said, one of the things we're interested in the methodology. This is just to give you an insight into the fact that to allow us to really see the added value of the ESM data, so the experience sampling, the app data, where we're sending these surveys 4 times a day, we put in a few questions where we really tried to parallel the data in the questionnaire and the ESM. And this was because what we wanted to do was to see the added value, to validate the two the two approaches. I'm not going to go into the detail here because I'm not sure this is what this particular audience is interested in. But what I wanted to show you is that it does raise serious questions about the use of these retrospective, what's traditionally been used in this area. And we've said there are mixed findings there. One of the possible explanations might be the validity of this data. As you can see here, the language contact questionnaire significantly overestimated the amount of language contact that the learners engaged in. And this was particularly the case for their use of English in person and in the UK. We won't look further there, though. Given that, today, what we want to talk about is we actually want to talk about what are the insights from the ESM data. So this experiencing sampling using the LangTrack app, where we're sending these short surveys 4 times a day. So first of all, what I'd like to draw out is that our results do very much sort of support existing findings in the literature, in the sense that they reiterate the fact that there's huge variation in individual learners' experiences when they study abroad. So we have some learners who engage in high levels of in-person interaction in English, and because it's in person, that means it's oral interaction. They're engaging in conversations with their compatriots in English, but also with other learners, whether they're learners from the UK or learners from other countries in English. And then on the other hand, at the other end of the continuum, we've got learners who are engaging in high levels of online interaction in their L1, and typically through the written modality. So we've got huge variation here across our sample. So, well, what does that mean if we kind of look at this kind of quantitatively and with a focus on our questions there? So first of all, if we do some cross tabulations of the data, what we find is that a very high proportion of the conversations took place online. And actually there were twice as many of the conversations were with people at home rather than with people in the UK. So if we drill down to just looking at these online conversations, which are taking up a large proportion of their interactions, more of those conversations are with people at home in their L1 than in their in the UK in the L2. If we then move on to focusing on the modality, we'll see that most of those conversations are written. So these online, well, overall in our data, what this means is that there's a high proportion of online written conversations. And those conversations are written, sorry, I can't see the slide here, are written interactions in their L1. If we then, so we can see that they're written in their L1. If we then drill down further and we think about where those conversations are, we tend to find that it's in their bedrooms, in their study bedrooms, in their halls of residence that they're having these conversations. And so what we can see is that most of their conversations are taking place at home in their halls of residence, and most of the conversations are in their L1 rather than in English. So if we drill down to those conversations that they're having at home, we can see that those conversations tend to be online. And we can see that most of the time that they're happening in the L1 with people in their home country. So what then does this mean for their linguistic and their academic attainment? So the results here are just to show you that we measured this. And well, maybe surprisingly, there isn't a correlation between the Lextel and the GPA. But what we're interested in, what does this mean? What does their language contact mean for these outcomes that we're interested in? So if we look at their outcomes here, what we see is that we do have, while they're not statistically significant, we do have interactions between their level of interaction in English and their GPA. So in the direction we'd expected, the more that they converse in English in person, the higher their GPA. And on the other hand, the more that they converse in person in their L1, the lower their Lextel score. So these are the kinds of relationships that we would expect. And then if we look at mode and attainment, what I think is really, really interesting here, and where we're seeing a significant correlation, is actually that the more they engage in written interactions in English, so here these will be online interactions, the higher their GPA. So I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting things that we see here, is this significant interaction between written English communication interaction, so kind of text messaging, WhatsApping, whatever they might, or online social media interactions, and their GPA. And then if we look at the purposes, what we see is we've got, again, we see here, if they're socializing and doing that in English, we've got a relationship with a GPA, and we've got a significant negative interaction between engaging in their studies in their L1 and their linguistic attainment. So the more they're engaging in their studies in their L1, the lower their Lextel score. So I'll hand over to Claire, who'll draw that all together to you and give you her insights into what we think this all means and what the implications are.
So thanks very much, Zoe. So I guess you can agree with us that in a sense this confirms what we thought was likely to happen. This certainly goes back to work I've been doing for the last 15 years, which is you can come with really quite high IELTS to UK, but still struggle to develop the opportunities to have conversations in the L2. But also that sort of connection between come and study in the host language environment, you will perfect your language skills, sort of implying that will affect all of your language skills, including your academic attainment. We can see that it is much, much more nuanced. We are confirming the high levels of variation, but we think what we're doing here that's new is just demonstrating the wide range of different contexts where we see the levels of variation. It's not perhaps a surprise in this era of digital literacy that we see a high proportion of online conversations, and it is not particularly surprising that they are sitting there in their home, in their halls of residence, doing a lot of online conversations in their L1. However, this is what I think we got very excited about, was when we could see the number of written interactions. Remember, these are informal. These are informal, text messaging and so on. That there was quite a high proportion in English that seemed to be more favoured, if you like. What that means in terms of these interactions with the linguistic and academic attainment, of course, this is cross-sectional. We don't have any longitudinal data. That's what we're applying for funding to do, because it's possible that, in fact, what we're looking here is at the relationship the other way around. If your general vocabulary is lower, you're more likely to stick to your L1 because of perhaps confidence or so forth. Perhaps if you know your general academic attainment is well, you feel you can express yourself quite confidently in academic written English, that might imply generally higher or English proficiency, and therefore perhaps more confidence in also social interactions, but again written online rather than spoken. So the direction of those relationships between interaction and linguistic and academic attainment, we aren't claiming one way or another way at the moment. As Zoe's already mentioned, we were somewhat stymied by taking a heck of a long time for our institutions to grant us ethical clearance, as well as a couple of technical issues. So it's a small sample size administered outside the main time of semester. But I've done a couple of longitudinal studies in the past, comparing both in-semester and out-of-semester times. To be honest, these findings are fairly parallel. It doesn't typically make a difference. What we want to try and draw out for you today as our audience is trying to emphasize this idea that digital communication can be an enabler. We don't think it's an excuse to hide behind the digital L1 bubble. We see that digital can be a scaffolding route towards interaction in the L2. If we are using more L1 as well as L2 during study abroad, this isn't necessarily the zero-sum game. What we need to do is look at the purposes for why they are using their different L1s and L2s. Remember, some of our participants here had IELTS 7, IELTS 8. This is not a proficiency issue. It's perhaps a feeling of confidence or a choice issue, or a task contextual issue that you prefer to use your L1 for certain things rather than another. So there's still sort of a gap in people's ease in finding their way towards having L2 conversations or written interactions, and we still need to understand what might facilitate or inhibit those ways of developing more L2 use. But we're really trying to use our evidence here to suggest it is not a question of one coming at the cost of the other. However, what we are interested in is this idea that the informal interaction in English, just general usage of English, this seems to be able to facilitate the academic attainment in at least some of our participants, where if we look at other research that suggests international students are always discriminated against or are suffering difficulties by having to operate with literacy skills in a second language, well then perhaps this idea of using written rather than face-to-face interactions can be a way forward to close that gap. We also want to try and be positive around the idea of digital usage, this idea of permanently on, permanently connected. Of course, we have to be aware psychologically, neurologically of what the risks are for this kind of digital life. But you know, it is just much more normal for everyone to have a digital interaction tool at their disposal almost all the time. While we know there are costs, we also want to see here, although it's just exploratory, some evidence that if used well, then this kind of digital space can be facilitatory. We see our users as becoming very skilled navigators, plurilingual navigators of the digiverse, as we call it. You know, they're developing good intercultural skills. They're developing this way of balancing both languages in a multilingual setting. So, you know, these are digital skills, linguistic skills, communication skills, pragmatic skills, task skills, and the digital space is one where they can flourish. It isn't necessarily problematic. However, as I've said already, we're not quite sure of the directionality of some of our interactions, so we need to do more on this. And partly going back to that idea of what other research has done from psychology and social efficacy, if people are now preferring to communicate online only, and we're seeing pragmatic deficits in people, the so-called Generation Alpha fear of picking up the phone and having a conversation to a real person in real time, you know, we need to understand what the digital space means for other issues around well-being. But we want to finish with this idea of the really emphasizing the online language exchange context, the digital context, where written interaction is the primary mode of building interaction. This can also facilitate other kinds of language opportunities, whether we're looking at online language exchanges, collaborative online learning, virtual study abroad, and so on, which is another area I'm working on, where we see text chat as a way of scaffolding that confidence towards real-time spontaneous oral interaction, and particularly face-to-face in-person oral interaction. So there's a quote here from a paper that's actually a little while ago, and we think it still holds good for now. That the strongest advantage of written, synchronous computer-mediated communication, CMC, over asynchronous CMC is this capacity for rapid interaction, whilst just being that little bit slower and a little bit less pressured than the face-to-face interaction, because it allows people to reflect. So as Satar and Ozdana say, in that sense, it's a cognitive amplifier. By being able to reflect in the middle of rapid interaction, you're having what Beauvoir calls a conversation in slow motion, which I think is a fantastic idea, or Payne and Whitney talking about the conversation simulator. It is real, it is authentic, it is all about that idea of you choosing to be yourself in the online communication, but just somehow without that final level of pressure that it means that spontaneous face-to-face unprepared interaction is the hardest skill of all to manage. So therefore, by using text chat and including features of slower written reflective ability to think about what you're writing, but also the sort of authenticity of speaking, that can be both focused on form if needed, but you retain this idea of conversational feel, that kind of real life flow that you need. And so, you know, I think in that sense, we see the very fine-grained data we're getting from the app as showing us how students are navigating these stepping stones towards their goals and aims, and being relatively satisfied with this kind of digital interaction and what a positive outcome that can be. If anybody's teaching these students, don't worry if they're on their devices. Just make sure that they're encouraged to see this as a positive step forward. Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of the talk, and we have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat. So if you do have a question, please pop them into the chat, and I will read them out loud to our presenters. So the first is a question about clarification. David had missed what the students' goals are. Is it content learning? Is it academic language development? Is it social language development? Can you clarify that for him, please?
Yeah, so these are students enrolled on a master's program. So they're here to content is important, but equally, as we know from the literature, students may be aiming to improve their academic attainment, and some I'll maybe Claire can elaborate on whether she's read this kind of literature more recently. It may be sort of social engagement as well, but ultimately they are enrolled on a master's program, all of the students in this particular study.
Yeah, I think we can say that there's a primary goal and secondary goal. In our interviews, we don't actually ask them to articulate it specifically, because we want to well, you can see we were dealing with a number of variables, but master's programs were typically, well, I think they were from all disciplines. There was social sciences, there was language, linguistics and TESOL, there was education, there was psychology. There's one from geography, was it, or international development? But across
There was
a wide
certainly
range.
sciences in there as well.
Yeah.
So it was from a wide range of disciplines. And to answer the question in the chat, yeah, these were master's students. These were not undergraduate students. So
Yeah.
they had been here. Most of them had been here for about what, 8-9 months
6, 9 months, yeah.
when
8,
we
9 months.
so if they may, some of them may have been on a pre-sessional, so maybe a couple of, say, 6 weeks to 3 months beforehand, but most of them had just been here for 9 months. We're not talking about undergraduate students who may have been here for a much longer period of time.
I think that clarified everything for David. I had a quick question about, you mentioned gaps in L2 conversations and how to facilitate that better. Based on previous research that you've done to perhaps help build this study, is there anything that you've seen that has been applied to different types of teaching and learning settings to help facilitate that engagement a little bit more?
Well, it's actually, I don't know about Zoe at York, but at Leeds we're piloting a number of sort of seminar-based opportunities for students to get, as it were, above the kind of academic skills mentality that I've got to learn how to read in English, think in English, write in English in a very focused academic sense, without remembering that they can also perhaps have a more social time if they're chatting in English. But I think where we're going, where this research adds certainly to my toolkit, is that the assumption is the more you can chat in person, that's kind of the starting point. And what we want to suggest is perhaps that's the end point. And can we find some ways of creating this online interactional mode as a couple of ways of practicing? Because what a lot of our students are saying is we don't know how to just start small talk. We don't know the etiquette of small talk conversations. So I'm building a package of year-round, what we call welcome, induction, transition, and one of them is going to be on how to start a conversation. And
Yeah. So can I pick up on there?
yeah.
I think that's where I'd have probably said there's a real gap in providing the support that students need before they come to study abroad. And it, I mean, not to say it's not to say it's a deficit, I don't want to say that. It's just really challenging because it's easy to develop and design interactions that are kind of service encounters, that are things that you can simulate in the classroom. What's much more difficult is this social, chat. What does it mean to chat? What are the social rules? What are valid topics in the target culture? There's all sorts of things there. But not just that, it's the fact that it can go in all sorts of different directions. And so this is where I personally see that there's a really big role for technology. So even before ChatGPT, large language models were a thing, there was research on developing chatbots to support language learners, to give this untiring practice in a non-judgmental way that might be able to, in another way to what we've seen with written, text messaging, might provide the oral interaction that can build that confidence. And I have been talking to companies, and I've forgotten which one it is, but that are interested in this possibility of whether we can harness LLMs to be able to move beyond providing learners unlimited interactional practice with a virtual conversational partner, to move it from this kind of service encounters domain or these more restricted contexts, which is traditionally what we've been able to do with AI to kind of model, to move into the more open unstructured, unpredictable kinds of conversations that you'd actually have, and are the kinds where you do well, you build relationships. That's building relationships comes out of the unexpected points of commonalities that you find that might lead you in different directions. So I think what I hope is we can build on this with the novel methods, and build towards some interventions that build in technology in those ways as an intervention, to support learners' development as well.
I think one of the areas that we were interested in came out of some of the reading, I think, is the CNU, where they talk about students managing to have, fairly well drilled role plays that they know they can use when they go to a doctor or a bank or talk to someone about their phone account, but that's not really expressing themselves authentically. And if the assumption from a sort of immersion starting point for SLA is that, learn to use the language, as proficiently as you can, so you can express yourself authentically, you can be the real you. That's a really, really big ask.
Can I just say, it made me, when you started talking about service encounters then, and the real you, I think the other thing is that, we do train learners for service encounters, but the real world service encounter isn't as structured as we
Yeah.
might seem. And actually, what can throw learners is that it's much more like the social interaction. And actually, what's really interesting, I'm not sure if it was one of these, it might have been one of these participants who talked about how one of their friends here was, they used to go to the supermarket and have a chat with one of the cashiers or someone who stacked shelves in the supermarket. And that's where you get the potential for growth in your language. Sorry, I cut in there, Claire, but I thought that was a really important.
I think what I've been working on for a while, since my original research that showed these ongoing sort of thresholds that can be a barrier to feeling like you matter. You've come to this international country, you want to feel like you're not invisible. How can you develop that self-efficacy, that resilience, that autonomy to say, yeah, I can take charge of my language learning journey? The assumption is spontaneous oral proficiency is the clue to that. But what I think we're seeing from our data here is that for people for whom that seems to be a too big a jump to do at once, giving them the chance to use these written interactions is a scaffolding way forward. So we have something we call the language zone here at Leeds, where people can buddy up as tandem partners, and they can chat in the other language, sort of half-half. What I'm going to be recommending to them is that they set up the chance to do that online first. And so it's you have develop your online sort of skills first, and then that will give you the confidence to meet face-to-face later. It's definitely the face-to-face is definitely for me, is beginning to be more about yes, it's certainly cognitive load, the ability to retrieve in real time under pressure, but I think there's much more about this socio-pragmatic confidence. And I think the idea of using the written interaction format first, I think that helps just unpack some of those barriers.
Nathan's popped in a resource into the chat there. I'm saying the need for those meaningful, high-quality interactions is something Zhao and I found or call for in a recent study that looks at social interaction and phrasal verb development for international students in the UK. So there's a link there for anyone who is interested to follow up with that resource. Thank you so much, Nathan, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You have about 10 minutes. If anyone does have any other questions, you can pop them into the chat. And Zoe and Claire, if you have any other piece of information you'd like to share, that'd be great. Oh, thanks. Haranet has a question here. So it says, regarding your observations that the language contact questionnaire overestimated spoken interaction as opposed to ESM, it seemed like your ESM question sampled on sampled only a max of 4 hours per day, so comparing total reported durations may be deceiving. Have you done any other comparisons with the two data sets, such as comparing the correlations between Luxtail and the ESM data to the correlations with the survey data?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a really important observation that we did only sample 4 times a day. So I should say that first of all, we tried to make the data comparable. So I didn't explain that effectively we multiplied out so the Zhu and Rose style questions asked them to estimate per day, and then we assumed we've taken samples of X number of hours, so we multiplied it out so that we can make it comparable. First of all, we have done other analyses. I have to admit that those were quite some weeks ago, and my mind is in other elements of the digital world right now. We would though be happy to share those with you, Henriette, and we certainly, one of our aims is to publish the methodological insights as well. It has been highlighted to us that this is really a really important find, as well as the kind of understanding study abroad. The methodological insight is really important because there are so many studies. If we're thinking about psycholinguistic studies and other studies in SLA that use these self-report instruments, they get study abroad students to reflect back on their linguistic use, and if these and so what they often find in sort of psycholinguistic studies, a bit like you do in study abroad studies, is, well, there was no change, no one made any gains, yet they're telling us they've used the language and they're doing this. And so I think it really highlights the importance of revisiting some of these studies and using ESM rather than the retrospective survey to collect the data on language contact, to re-examine any relationships and help explain what may or may not be happening in these psycholinguistic studies.
I think, Henry, if I remember your methodology right, you did the hourly contact point, and then there was also an end of the day. Today, how much did you use? So you've in a sense you've got that way of cross comparing. So I think you know when we go to repeat this study again longitudinally, then we'll keep all of these different factors in mind.
I mean,
Yeah, and I should go on.
If I may cut in, sorry, it's easier than in writing, but I'm currently working on a study doing exactly that, sort of directly comparing these different data types. So that hence the very methodological question of, ooh, what else have you done with these two data sets?
Yeah, so we did there, you can see, I think, so we looked at activity multiplexes. So we've got a few other things. So mainly the variables that you'd see in the Zhu and Rose study, we've tried to parallel those as much as we could. So we do have some parallel data that we could share with you and we could have a chat about.
Yeah, really looking forward to that methodological paper. I do want to caution in saying that obviously being a big proponent of the ESM, I do believe that it adds value. But just because we see different data coming out of the two methods doesn't necessarily mean that the self-report questionnaires aren't accurate, right? So this is kind of why I was getting at that question of, well, we need to compare how these two data sources relate with other things.
Which one of them has the better explanatory value?
Exactly.
But I think,
it could be the ESM was wrong too, couldn't it?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, what we liked about the ESM was that it was these, you know, basically 4 questions that people could answer very, very quickly. But then you were a little bit limited, and with the survey, you know, we could create more questions to ask, and so you win and you lose with both approaches.
Exactly.
But I think, yeah, I think Ros Mitchell has done a recent overview of all the different kinds of technologies for surveying and getting data. I think what we're all beginning to agree is that just tapping the numbers is no longer giving us anything other than this variation. I'm really interested in this idea of what we could is, so there's a bilingualism study being done by my colleague Cecile Decat in Bradford, and they're talking about interactionally rich. And I think, you know, that captures the idea. It's not just how much, but it's why, who you're talking to, or why, what that person means to you at that time, and what that conversational or what that language encounter will end up being for you. And it may be that it's a short one, but you reflect on it later and you get a lot out of it. Or it could be that it gives you a chance, just, you know, practicing your phrasal verbs or formulate language or whatever. But it starts to be, oh, now I can really feel I'm being me. And for me, I think, you know, the more we get away from SLA being reciting your grammar book and your vocabulary list, and being, how do you have a conversation? How do you wish to have a conversation? How can you construct conversations? Then I think we're getting back to, you know, 50 years ago, the questions that informed that interactionist model that we're sort of slightly maybe losing track of in some aspects of SLA right now, I think. So yeah, I think for me, you know, it goes back to, what does an authentic conversation look like? How can we facilitate people having it? And if online digital is a tool towards that, then we can, you know, we can get everyone to practice that. It's another task, isn't it? We can get people to put these kind of tasks into their educational setting. But yeah, the more we can get away from people thinking that being proficient is reciting a set of grammar rules and reciting a list of vocabulary, you know, the better.
Thank you so
we'll do our
much.
best. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Indeed.
And thank you everyone for your questions and for joining into the conversation. We only have about 3 minutes left, so before we depart, I do want to share with everyone that we do have another seminar series coming up, and I'm putting the link into the chat for you all so you can view it there. It's another seminar that is brought to you by Language Education and Multilingualism strand of the LEM network. So if you're interested, please find the link. We do have a minute or two if Dr. Wright or Handley would like to add or say anything before we have to leave.
Well, just good, yes. And again, other work I'm doing that gets away from the idea of native as meaning anything at all. There's no such thing as native, and the more we can get away from that mythology and false comparator, the better. So I'm interested in that next talk very much.
Okay, well, I think we will end our call now. Thank you again for everyone who's joined the session. And if you would like to review the session, there will be a recording provided, so I can email you all with that information. Paula, is there anything that I should add?
No, that's really it. Thank you so much for handling this, Emma. But just mentioning, since I see some people were interested in the next seminar arranged by the LEM branch, we also have 2 more seminars coming up next Thursday and the Thursday after that, so maybe 15th, maybe 22nd, and they both kind of focus on the same topic. They are handled by the Global Englishes team, and they if you go on our network, I will just
I
put
have the
a
link here for
link.
you.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Yeah, if you go there, you can find all the information as well as the registration links. So if you'd like to, you can also join. But yeah, that's all I had to say. Thank you everybody for attending this session. It was our first for the LEM strand in a long time. So I'm really happy to see people enjoying this particular presentation. Thank you again, everybody.
No, and I wish the LENet network all the best. It's a fantastic organisation. I'm really glad to have come across it. There's other networks that Zoe and I are involved with, for example, the BAL, Language Learning and Teaching Special Interest Group. So perhaps we can share that detail later. And there's other networks on transnational mobility and language learning through transnational mobility that I help run. So I'm sure there's lots of future collaborative interests that we can pursue together. Thank you for your welcome today.
Yeah, thank you for organising. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you for
All the
joining
best
us.
then. Thank you.
And you're
Bye.
welcome to share the slides.
Wonderful. I
Yeah,
will
no,
do that.
I know what I went through the statistics a little quick there. So if people want to pore over them, sort of beyond the trends that were pulled out, they're welcome to do that.
Bye from me.
All right.
Thanks again. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you.
Speak to you soon, Zoe. Bye bye.
See you.
Much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I'll send everything out.
Okay, I
an
was just
email.
holding on in case there was anything you wanted to say, but thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And yeah, absolutely free to share the resources. Okay. Okay, I better
That's
shoot now. All right. Okay.
Have a good
See
day.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
And
Bye-bye.
you. Okay.
See
Take care.
you.
Thank you. Right, and there's Dr. Gifty. Wonderful. Do you have any questions?
No, you can just stop the recording
Yeah,
and